Some people don't belong in rooms like this. Ryan Blake didn't lower his voice when he said it, and that was the point. The glass-walled boardroom carried sound like a stage, every word gliding across polished oak and chrome, settling into the quiet spaces between tailored suits and curated confidence, and when the faint ripple of restrained laughter followed, it felt rehearsed, like something the room had been waiting for all morning. Evelyn Carter stood near the far end of the table, a slim folder resting in her hands, her reflection faintly mirrored in the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her where the skyline of downtown Chicago stretched wide and indifferent. The late morning sun filtered through a pale gray sky, casting a cold, even light that flattened everything, turning people into silhouettes of power rather than individuals. She didn't move, not when Ryan's eyes slid over her again, not when one of the junior analysts glanced down quickly to hide a smirk, not even when the assistant by the door shifted uncomfortably. As if sensing something she couldn't name, because Evelyn had already measured this room the moment she stepped inside, already felt its temperature, its rhythm, its hierarchy, and none of it surprised her anymore. 5 years ago this room had been different, or maybe she had been. Back then she had sat 3 seats from the head of the table, her voice steady but softer, her ideas filtered through hesitation, through the subtle corrections Ryan would make with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Back then she believed competence would be enough, that if she worked harder, stayed later, delivered cleaner numbers and sharper strategies, she would be seen. But what she learned instead was how easily credit could be redirected, how quickly doubt could be planted, how quietly a reputation could be dismantled until even you started to question your own reflection. Now Ryan stood at the center of the room, one hand resting casually on the back of a leather chair as if he owned the space, his navy suit perfectly tailored, his voice carrying that same confident edge that once convinced her to trust him, to build something with him, to believe in a future that had never truly included her. He tapped the screen behind him, shifting the presentation forward. Charts and projections glowing in crisp blues and whites, were discussing a major acquisition, he continued, his tone smooth, controlled. So naturally, we need people who understand scale, pressure, real stakes. His gaze flicked back to her, deliberate now, not nostalgia. Another soft ripple moved through the room, less laughter this time, more tension, like the air tightening just enough for people to realize they were watching something unfold. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in calculation. The folder in her hands remained unopened, her fingers relaxed against its edge, steady, grounded. The scent of polished wood and faint espresso lingered in the air, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. She could feel her heartbeat, not racing, not faltering, just present, a quiet metronome beneath the surface. Ryan turned away from her again, already dismissing her with the ease of someone who had done it before. Let's stay focused, he said, clicking to the next slide. We don't have time for distractions. The word hung there, heavier than the others. Evelyn lifted her gaze then, not to challenge him, not to correct him, but simply to look, really look, at the man who once believed she would always remain exactly where he had left her. And for a fraction of a second, something unspoken passed through her expression, not anger, not hurt, but something quieter, something far more dangerous, recognition, not of who he was, but of who he had never understood her to be. She stepped forward just enough for her presence to register again. Her voice when it came was calm, even, almost gentle. I'm not here to present, she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I'm just here to observe. Ryan let out a short breath, half a laugh, already turning back to the screen as if the conversation had ended before it began. Then observe, he replied lightly, and maybe learn something. The room settled again, the hum of the building's ventilation system filling the silence between clicks of the remote and the soft shifting of papers. But beneath it all, beneath the polished surface and practiced authority, something had already shifted, something small and precise, like a lock turning somewhere out of sight. And as Evelyn took her seat without another word, placing the unopened folder neatly in front of her, the sunlight caught the edge of the table just right, reflecting upward in a thin, sharp line that cut across the room, unnoticed by everyone except her. He thought she came to watch, he had no idea she came to decide. The meeting moved on as if nothing had happened, but the air no longer felt the same. It carried a thin, invisible tension that settled into the pauses between Ryan Blake's sentences, into the way a few people avoided looking directly at Evelyn Carter, into the subtle shift of posture from those who had laughed a little too quickly moments ago. Ryan continued presenting with practiced ease, his voice steady, confident, filling the room with projections, percentages, and promises of expansion. But every so often his gaze flickered back toward her, brief and sharp, like a reflex he could not quite control, as if some instinct beneath his certainty was trying to make sense of something that did not fit the narrative he had already decided. Evelyn sat still, her back straight against the leather chair, her hands resting lightly on the closed folder in front of her. She listened, not just to the words, but to the tone, the rhythm, the small hesitations buried beneath his performance. Because she knew that voice, she had learned its patterns long before anyone else in that room had earned the right to trust it. There had been a time when she believed every word he said, when late nights in a smaller conference room felt like partnership instead of strategy, when he would lean over her shoulder, pointing at spreadsheets, his voice low and persuasive, telling her they were building something that would outlast both of them. And she had believed him. She had stayed past midnight refining models, rewriting proposals, catching errors before they became problems, not for recognition, but because she thought they were on the same side, until the day everything shifted so quietly she almost missed it, the board meeting where her work appeared on the screen under his name, the subtle way he framed it as a joint effort before gradually removing her from the narrative altogether, the questions directed at him, the answers he gave without ever looking her way, and later, the conversation in this very building, not this room but one just down the hall, where he had told her, with that same calm tone, that maybe she was not ready for the level the company was moving toward, that maybe it would be better if she stepped back, reassessed, took time to grow, as if growth had not been the very thing she had been doing all along. She remembered standing there, the hum of the overhead lights louder than his words, realizing in a single, quiet moment that she had already been written out of the story. Now, years later, she watched him repeat the same patterns, the same controlled confidence, the same careful ownership of ideas that were never entirely his. The screen behind him shifted again, displaying a projected acquisition timeline, aggressive, ambitious, risky in ways that only someone certain of their position would attempt. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle, cautious, but said nothing. Ryan noticed and pressed forward, doubling down. "This is the direction we need if we want to stay competitive," he said, his voice firm. "Hesitation is what costs companies their future." The words echoed slightly in the room, and for a brief second, Evelyn felt the ghost of her former self, the version of her who would have spoken up, who would have pointed out the blind spots, the overextensions, the assumptions built on unstable ground. But that version of her had learned something valuable before she disappeared. Sometimes the most powerful position was not the one that spoke first, but the one that chose when to speak at all. Ryan clicked to the final slide, a summary that wrapped everything in certainty. He turned back to the room, scanning faces for approval, for agreement, for the validation he had always expected to follow his conclusions. "Any questions?" he asked, his tone almost casual, but there was an edge beneath it now, a quiet challenge. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, just long enough for the weight of it to settle, and then, slowly, Evelyn lifted her hand, not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen. Ryan's eyes locked onto her, something unreadable passing through them, a flicker of irritation. Or perhaps something closer to unease. "Yes," he said, the single word controlled, measured. She tilted her head slightly, her expression composed, almost thoughtful. "You are projecting a 30% growth within 12 months, she said, her voice even, clear, carrying effortlessly across the room without force, "based on a market that has already shown signs of contraction in the last 2 quarters. A few heads turned now, attention sharpening. Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We have accounted for that," he replied quickly. "Our models are solid." Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost polite nod, as if accepting his answer. "Of course," she said softly, and then she leaned back, her hand returning to rest on the folder, as if the question had been nothing more than a passing thought. But the room did not move on as easily this time. Something had shifted again, deeper now, more visible. Because it was no longer just about what had been said, it was about what had been noticed. Ryan turned back to the screen, continuing, but the smooth rhythm of his presentation had fractured, just slightly, just enough for those paying attention to feel it. And as Evelyn's fingers finally slid along the edge of the folder, not opening it, just aligning it perfectly with the table, her eyes lowered for a brief second before lifting again, calm, steady, patient. she did not need to correct him. Not yet, because the truth did not need to be argued, it only needed the right moment to be seen, and that moment was already on its way. The silence after her question did not break, it stretched, subtle but undeniable, settling into the edges of the room like a quiet pressure no one could quite ignore. Ryan Blake turned back to the screen, but the confidence that once filled his posture had thinned, not gone, but altered, like a reflection slightly distorted by moving water. He cleared his throat, adjusted his stance, and continued, as I was saying. The projected timeline accounts for all foreseeable variables. His voice remained steady, but the cadence had changed, just enough for those paying attention to notice the shift. A few executives exchanged brief glances, not openly challenging him, but no longer fully anchored to his certainty. Evelyn Carter did not move, her gaze remained calm, observant, as if she were watching a pattern unfold exactly as expected. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened without announcement, quiet, almost understated, yet it cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. Jonathan Reed stepped inside, his presence immediate but unforced, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. Conversation ceased, chairs straightened, attention redirected. Ryan turned instinctively, relief flickering across his face for a fraction of a second, as if the arrival of the chief executive officer would restore the balance he believed he controlled. Jonathan, he said, offering a polite nod, we were just wrapping up the acquisition overview. Jonathan Reed did not respond immediately, his gaze moved across the room once, measured, deliberate, taking in the screen, the arrangement of people, the subtle tension that lingered beneath the surface, and then, instead of moving toward the head of the table, he walked along the side, his steps unhurried, until he stopped beside Evelyn. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but it changed everything. Ryan's expression tightened, confusion flickering beneath his composed exterior. Good, Jonathan said finally, his voice calm, even, carrying a weight that settled into the room with quiet authority. Then this is the perfect time. He placed a single folder on the table in front of Evelyn, not the one she had brought, but a heavier one, embossed, deliberate, the kind of document that carried decisions rather than proposals. A few people leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening. Jonathan turned, addressing the room now, but standing beside her rather than above them. Before we move forward with any projections, he continued, there is something that needs to be clarified. Ryan stepped forward half a pace, his brows drawing together. Is there an issue? He asked, controlled, but no longer entirely certain. Jonathan's gaze met his briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply steady. No issue, he said, just an update. The word landed softly, but it carried more weight than anything Ryan had presented that morning. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the new folder. She did not open it yet, did not rush the moment. Her breathing remained even, her posture unchanged, as if she had been here all along, waiting not for permission, but for alignment. Jonathan turned slightly toward her, and for the first time, the room followed his attention fully. Let me introduce this properly, he said, his voice lowering just enough to draw everyone in, the kind of quiet that demanded listening. Effective today, all controlling shares of this company have been transferred. A ripple of movement passed through the room, subtle, restrained, but unmistakable. Ryan's eyes widened just slightly, his focus shifting from Jonathan to the folder, then to Evelyn, something unsteady flickering beneath his composed surface. Jonathan continued, without pause, without dramatics, to Miss Evelyn Carter. The words settled into the space with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Silence followed, not the casual quiet of a meeting pause, but the kind that emptied the room of everything unnecessary. Ryan stood still, his mouth parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The certainty that had carried him moments ago now suspended, unresolved. Evelyn finally opened the folder, her movements unhurried, deliberate, confirming what had already been said without needing to emphasize it. She glanced down briefly, then closed it again, as if the details were already familiar, because they were. When she looked up, her gaze met Ryan's, not sharp, not cruel, simply steady, grounded in something he could not reach. Jonathan stepped back half a pace, not withdrawing, but making space, the shift subtle, yet symbolic. The room understood before anyone said it aloud. The center of gravity had changed. Evelyn placed her hand lightly on the table. Her voice when it came was calm, measured, leaving no need for volume. Please continue, she said, looking at Ryan, the same words he had used earlier, but carrying an entirely different weight now, and in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that she had never come to argue, never come to defend herself, she had come to take her place, and there was nothing left for him to stand on. No one moved at first, not because they did not understand what had just happened, but because they understood it too well, the kind of understanding that did not arrive with noise but with a quiet, irreversible shift. Ryan Blake remained standing where he was, his hand still loosely gripping the remote control, though the screen behind him had already dimmed into something irrelevant, the charts, the projections, the confidence he had built his presentation on, all of it now felt like background noise in a room that had chosen a new center. He looked at Evelyn Carter as if recalculating her in real time, as if trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed minutes ago with the reality now sitting across from him, but the equation did not resolve, it fractured, because the version of her he understood no longer existed. Evelyn did not rush the silence, she let it settle, let it stretch just long enough for every person in the room to feel the weight of what had changed. Her fingers rested lightly against the folder, her posture unchanged, composed, grounded, as if this moment was not a surprise but a continuation. Jonathan Reed stepped slightly to the side, no longer the focal point, his role complete, the authority he carried now transferred without ceremony, and in that subtle movement, the hierarchy of the room realigned completely. Ryan finally exhaled, a controlled breath, but it carried something new, something unsteady beneath the surface. I was not aware, he began, his voice measured, careful, as if choosing each word with precision, that there had been a change in ownership. The statement was neutral, but it carried an undercurrent of disbelief. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, almost neutral, but not distant. There was clarity there, a quiet certainty that did not need to be emphasized. That is correct, she replied, her voice even. The transition was finalized this morning. A few executives shifted in their seats, the information settling into them piece by piece. Some began to glance at their notes, others at Evelyn, reassessing, recalibrating, understanding that the meeting they thought they were attending had just become something else entirely. Ryan nodded once, a small motion, as if acknowledging a fact he could not dispute. But his grip on the situation had already loosened. Then perhaps, he said, attempting to regain structure, it would be appropriate to revisit the agenda. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering him for a brief moment, not dismissing, not interrupting, simply allowing the space for him to finish, before responding. No, she said gently, the single word soft but absolute. It did not cut, it did not challenge, but it redirected everything. The room stilled again, listening. Please continue, she added, her tone unchanged. I would like to hear the rest of your proposal. Ryan blinked once, the shift subtle but visible, because the invitation was not a concession, it was an evaluation. The difference was unmistakable. He glanced briefly at Jonathan, as if expecting reinforcement, but Jonathan remained still, observant, offering nothing, because nothing was needed. Ryan turned back toward the screen, pressing the remote. The presentation flickered back to life, but the energy had changed. The authority behind his words no longer came from position, but from scrutiny. And everyone in the room felt it. Every number he referenced now carried weight in a different way. Every assumption felt exposed under a lens he could not control. Evelyn listened, not interrupting, not correcting, her gaze steady, attentive, as if she were allowing him every opportunity to stand on his own conclusions. But beneath that calm, there was precision, a quiet awareness of every detail he presented, every risk he chose not to mention, every gap he hoped would go unnoticed, and the room began to follow her lead. The executives who had once nodded along now leaned in, their attention sharper, their silence more deliberate, because they understood, without being told, that the outcome of this meeting was no longer a foregone conclusion. Ryan reached the end of his presentation again, but this time, when he turned to face the room, the question, any questions, did not come as easily. It lingered, caught between what had been and what now was. Evelyn allowed a brief pause, just enough for the weight of the moment to settle, before she spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying effortlessly. Walk me through your risk mitigation plan again, she said, not as a challenge, not as a correction, but as a request that carried expectation. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that the balance had not just shifted, it had been rewritten, because she did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to remind him of what had just been revealed. the room already knew, and so did he, and the only thing left was to see whether he could stand in the space he once believed he owned. Ryan Blake did not answer immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed. It lingered in the space between Evelyn Carter's question and his response, stretching just long enough to shift the room further in her direction. He glanced briefly at the screen behind him as if the answer might be waiting there, already prepared, already structured, but the slides that once felt like certainty now looked static. Incomplete. Our mitigation strategy, he began, his voice steady, but lacking the earlier ease, focuses on diversification across emerging sectors, reducing dependency on volatile markets. The words were correct, polished, the kind of language that usually reassured rooms like this, but something beneath them felt thinner now, less anchored. Evelyn watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, attentive, giving him the space to continue, but not offering him anything to lean on. He stepped forward slightly, regaining a fraction of his composure. We have built-in contingency buffers, he added, gesturing toward the screen, adjusting for potential contraction over a 6 to 9 month period. A few heads nodded, but more slowly this time, more carefully. As if each agreement required verification rather than assumption, Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly to the screen, then back to him, her eyes steady, focused. And if the contraction extends beyond 9 months, she asked, her tone calm, almost conversational, but the question landed with precision, cutting through the generalities he had relied on. Ryan paused again, just for a second, but it was enough. The room felt it, the shift from presentation to examination. He straightened, his voice tightening slightly. We would reassess and reallocate resources accordingly, he replied. But the answer sounded broader than before, less defined. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the response, but not fully accepting it. Reallocation requires liquidity, she said gently. Where is your reserve margin allocated in that scenario? The question was specific now, narrowing the focus, and the room leaned in almost imperceptibly. The executives who had remained silent were now listening with intent, because this was no longer about the presentation, it was about the foundation beneath it. Ryan's grip on the remote tightened subtly, his thumb pressing against the edge as if grounding himself. The reserves are distributed across multiple accounts, he said, choosing his words carefully, to ensure flexibility. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, measured acknowledgement, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was evaluative. And everyone felt it, because flexibility without clarity was not strength, it was exposure. Ryan exhaled slowly, shifting his weight, attempting to reclaim momentum. The model is designed to adapt, he added, but the confidence in the statement did not carry the same weight it had earlier. Evelyn's fingers moved slightly against the table, a subtle motion, controlled, deliberate. She did not challenge him directly, did not dismantle his argument piece by piece. She simply allowed the gaps to exist in the open, visible, undeniable, and that was enough, because the room was already beginning to see them. One of the senior executives leaned forward slightly, glancing between Ryan and Evelyn, as if waiting for the next exchange, the next layer to unfold. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice steady, composed. Adaptation requires clarity, she said, not as a correction, but as a statement that settled into the space between them, and clarity requires ownership of risk. She paused briefly, just enough for the words to resonate. Right now, I am not hearing that ownership. Ryan's expression shifted, just slightly, the first visible crack in the composure he had maintained. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something closer to realization, the recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer stable, that the structure he had relied on was being evaluated from a position he could not influence. Evelyn did not press further, she did not need to, the point had already landed. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, her presence still quiet, but the authority in the room now rested with her completely, not declared, not emphasized, simply understood. And as Ryan stood there, searching for the next words, the next angle, the next way to regain control, it became clear that this was no longer his presentation, no longer his room. It was a moment he had not prepared for, a moment where confidence alone was not enough. And across from him, Evelyn Carter remained still, patient, and entirely in control. Because she was not there to interrupt him, she was there to see him clearly, and for the first time, so was everyone else. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed, it held it, almost deliberately now, as if everyone present understood that something more important than numbers was unfolding. Ryan Blake stood at the front, the remote still in his hand, but no longer in control of the pace. His presentation had shifted from a performance into a reflection, and reflections could not be controlled, only revealed. He glanced briefly at the screen again, but the data no longer anchored him the way it had before, because the questions had moved beyond the slides, beyond the projections, into something far less forgiving. Evelyn Carter remained still, her presence quiet yet undeniable, her gaze steady, not pressing, not forcing, simply waiting, and that waiting carried its own kind of pressure, because it required him to continue without being led, without being corrected, without being saved. Ryan inhaled slowly, straightening his posture as if rebuilding the structure he had lost moments ago. The reserve margins can be adjusted, he said, his voice more measured now, less performative. We can restructure allocation if the market shifts beyond expected thresholds. The words were more careful this time, less confident but more deliberate, and the room responded to that change, not with approval, but with attention. Because for the first time, he was no longer speaking to impress, he was speaking to answer. Evelyn's eyes remained on him, attentive, focused, but not unkind. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no trace of triumph, only clarity, the kind that came from understanding exactly where someone stood. She let a brief pause pass, just enough for his words to settle, before asking, "And what would you prioritize first?" Her tone remained calm, almost quiet, but the question reached deeper than the ones before. It was no longer about structure, but about judgment. Ryan hesitated again, but this time it was different, less defensive, more thoughtful, as if he were, for the first time, considering the answer instead of delivering it. "Liquidity," he said after a moment, "maintaining operational stability before expansion." A subtle shift moved through the room, small, but noticeable, because the answer carried weight, not certainty, but awareness. Evelyn nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the response without amplifying it, and in that small gesture, something changed again, not in the hierarchy, but in the dynamic, because this was no longer a dismantling, it was an evaluation, and Ryan, whether he realized it or not, had stepped into it fully. He continued, his voice steadier now, though quieter. "We would scale back non-essential acquisitions and reinforce core assets," he added, the words coming with more intention, less performance. Evelyn listened, her posture unchanged, her presence still, but there was a shift in her gaze now, almost imperceptible, a recognition, not of success, but of effort, of adjustment, of someone beginning to understand the space they were in. Around them, the executives remained silent, but their attention had deepened, no longer passive observers, but engaged witnesses to a recalibration happening in real time. Jonathan Reed stood at the side, his expression unreadable, but his stillness suggested approval, not of the outcome, but of the process, because this was what the room was meant to do, not validate certainty, but reveal truth. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority it had held from the moment she entered. "That is a stronger position," she said, not as praise, but as acknowledgement, and the distinction mattered, because it did not elevate him, it simply recognized the shift. Ryan met her gaze, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no attempt to assert dominance, no attempt to reclaim the space he had lost, only a steady, grounded look, as if he were seeing her clearly now, not as the version he had defined years ago, but as the one sitting in front of him, composed, precise, and entirely beyond his influence. The room remained quiet, but the tension had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer reactive, it had softened into something more focused, more intentional, because the moment of revelation had passed, and what remained was something far more enduring. The reality of who held the room, and why. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze still on Ryan, but no longer questioning, simply observing, allowing him to continue if he chose, because she did not need to take anything from him, she only needed to see what he would do next. And in that quiet, steady presence, it became clear that the power she held was not just in what had been revealed, but in what she chose to do with it. And for the first time, Ryan Blake understood that this was not a moment he could control, it was one he had to meet. Ryan Blake did not return to the screen immediately this time. Instead he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the remote loose in his hand, his attention no longer divided between slides and audience but anchored fully in the room itself. Something in his posture had changed, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. The sharp edges of his earlier confidence had softened into something more deliberate, more aware, as if he had stepped out of a script he once knew by heart and into a space where every word required intention. Evelyn Carter watched him quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them, no longer adversarial, no longer rooted in past assumptions, but balanced on something new, something neither of them had fully occupied before. Ryan finally placed the remote down on the table, the small sound of plastic against wood cutting cleanly through the quiet. A decision, subtle but significant. The current model, he said, his voice steadier now, less performative, relies too heavily on projected acceleration without enough structural backing. A faint ripple moved through the room, not surprise, but recognition. Because this was not the same tone he had started with, this was not the same version of him that had dismissed, deflected, and controlled. This was someone reassessing in real time. Evelyn did not react outwardly, but her gaze sharpened slightly, attentive, present, allowing him the space to continue. If we move forward as outlined, he added, we increase exposure without securing long-term stability. He paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but to choose his next words carefully. That is a risk we should not ignore. The statement settled into the room, and this time, it did not feel like a performance, it felt like ownership. The executives around the table shifted subtly, some leaning forward, others exchanging brief glances, because they understood what was happening, not just a correction of strategy, but a shift in perspective. Ryan looked toward Evelyn, not seeking approval, not asking for validation, but acknowledging her presence in a way he had not before, as if recognizing that this moment, this adjustment, existed within a space she now defined. Evelyn held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, not encouraging, not approving, simply acknowledging that he had stepped into something real, and that acknowledgement carried more weight than any praise could have. Ryan continued, his voice gaining a different kind of steadiness, quieter, but more grounded. We should delay expansion until core performance stabilizes, he said, and reassess acquisition targets with a more conservative approach. The words were clear, direct. No longer wrapped in ambition for the sake of impression, but built on evaluation. The room absorbed it, not as a correction forced upon him, but as a conclusion he had arrived at himself, and that distinction mattered, because it changed how the decision would hold beyond this moment. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture composed, but engaged now in a way that signaled transition, not from observer to participant, but from evaluation to direction. That is a responsible adjustment, she said, her voice calm, even, but carrying quiet authority. Ryan listened, not interrupting, not anticipating, simply present, and in that stillness, the shift between them became clearer, no longer defined by past imbalance, but by present reality. Evelyn glanced briefly at the executives around the table, her gaze steady, inclusive, drawing them into the moment without effort. We are not here to chase projections, she continued, her tone measured, we are here to build something that holds under pressure. The words were simple, but they settled deeply, because they aligned with something the room recognized, something they had not heard articulated with such clarity before. Ryan remained still, listening, absorbing, not resisting, and in that quiet acceptance, something else shifted, something internal, less visible but no less significant, because for the first time, he was not trying to control the narrative, he was part of it. Evelyn's gaze returned to him, steady, composed, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow, not in tension, but in focus. Continue refining the model, she said, not as a command, but as direction. Bring me a version that reflects what you just said, not what you thought we wanted to hear. Ryan nodded once, the motion small but grounded. Understood, he replied, and this time, the word carried weight, not as agreement, but as commitment. The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one that followed clarity rather than uncertainty, and as Evelyn leaned back slightly, her presence steady, composed, it became clear that this was no longer about what had been revealed, it was about what would follow, because power was not in the moment of change, it was in what came after, and for the first time, Ryan Blake understood that what came next would not be defined by him alone. The meeting did not end when the conversation slowed. it deepened, the kind of shift that did not rely on noise but on awareness. The executives who had once followed Ryan Blake's lead without question now sat differently, their attention no longer passive, their silence no longer neutral. They were thinking, evaluating, recalibrating in real time, and at the center of it all, Evelyn Carter remained composed. Her presence steady, not dominating the room, but defining it in a way that felt almost effortless. She glanced briefly at the skyline beyond. The glass walls, the city stretching outward in layers of steel and reflection, a reminder of scale, of consequence, of decisions that reached far beyond this table. Then her attention returned to the room, grounded, precise. "Let us revisit the acquisition timeline," she said, her voice calm, but carrying direction now, not suggestion. The shift was subtle, but absolute. No one questioned it, not even Ryan, who nodded once and reached for the remote again, this time without hesitation, but also without the earlier performance. The screen lit up once more, but the presentation had changed, not visually, but in intention. "If we adjust for stability first," Ryan began, his tone measured, "we can extend the timeline by 12 to 18 months. He moved through the slides with more care now, each point deliberate, each assumption more clearly stated, as if he were building something rather than selling it. Evelyn listened, her gaze attentive, occasionally shifting toward different members of the room, drawing them in without speaking, and one by one, they began to engage. A senior executive cleared his throat, offering a cautious observation about operational costs. Another added a perspective on market trends. The conversation expanded, not chaotically, but organically, shaped by the structure Evelyn had set without ever explicitly stating it. Ryan responded to each point, not defensively, but thoughtfully, adjusting, refining, acknowledging, and with each exchange, the distance between who he had been at the start of the meeting and who he was now became more visible, not erased, but transformed. Evelyn leaned slightly forward, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture open, receptive, but still grounded in control. "What about internal capacity?" she asked, her tone steady, inviting analysis rather than imposing it. Ryan paused, considering, then answered, "We would need to strengthen mid-level management before scaling." The response came more naturally this time, less guarded, because it was rooted in assessment rather than projection. Evelyn nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and the room followed that cue, the discussion evolving into something collaborative, something real. Jonathan Reed remained silent at the side, his presence still, observant, but no longer central, because the leadership he had once represented now sat at the table itself, embodied not in volume or authority, but in clarity. Evelyn allowed the conversation to move, guiding it only when necessary, her voice entering at precise moments, never interrupting, never overpowering, but always redirecting with intention. And as the minutes passed, the energy of the room continued to shift. What had begun as a demonstration of control had become a process of alignment. Ryan glanced at her once, briefly, as if measuring the space between them, and in that glance, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, no hint of the man who had once defined her by what he believed she lacked. Only recognition, quiet and undeniable. Evelyn met his gaze for a moment, then looked back to the table, because this was not about him, not anymore. It was about the company, the people in the room, the decisions that would shape everything beyond it. "We move forward carefully," she said finally, her voice calm, conclusive, not ending the conversation, but anchoring it. "We build from strength, not assumption." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not imposed, but accepted. Ryan lowered the remote slowly, the movement unhurried, and nodded once, not out of obligation, but understanding, because for the first time, he was not trying to lead the room, he was part of it. And as the discussion continued, no longer centered on him, but flowing through the structure Evelyn had established, it became clear that what had changed was not just who held the power, but how that power was used, not to dominate, not to prove, but to create something that could stand on its own. And in that quiet, steady shift, the room found a new rhythm, one that no longer needed to be controlled, because it had already been redefined. By the time the conversation began to settle into a steady rhythm, the room no longer resembled the one that had existed an hour ago. The sharp edges of ego and assumption had been worn down into something quieter, more deliberate, and at the center of that transformation sat Evelyn Carter, not elevated by volume or spectacle, but anchored by clarity. The kind that did not demand attention yet commanded it all the same. She allowed the final points of discussion to unfold without interruption. Listening as the executives refined timelines, adjusted expectations, and aligned on a direction that now felt grounded rather than ambitious for its own sake, Ryan Blake stood slightly to the side of the screen now, no longer positioned as the focal point, but not diminished either, simply repositioned, his role reshaped by the space he had stepped into. He contributed where necessary, his voice steady, his responses measured, and though the confidence he carried had changed, it had not disappeared. It had matured into something less rigid, more aware, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Evelyn's gaze moved across the table one last time, taking in each person, each expression, each quiet recalibration that had taken place. She did not rush to conclude, did not impose a formal end. Instead she allowed the room to reach its own natural pause, the kind that comes when something has been resolved not by declaration, but by understanding. And when that moment arrived, she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough weight to settle the room completely. "We will proceed with the revised approach," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision that no one questioned. Stability first, expansion second. The words were simple, but they carried the outcome of everything that had unfolded. The room absorbed them without resistance, because they had already arrived there together. Ryan nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, not of authority imposed, but of direction understood. The executives followed, some making notes, others simply sitting back. The tension that had once filled the room now replaced with something steadier, something resolved. Jonathan Reed remained by the side, his presence unchanged, but his role now complete. The transition he had facilitated no longer required his reinforcement, because the room had already accepted what had shifted. Evelyn gathered her folder, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if there was no need to mark the moment as anything other than what it was, a continuation, not a climax. She stood, and as she did, the room followed, not out of formality, but out of recognition. Ryan remained where he was for a brief second longer, watching her, not with the confusion that had marked his earlier expressions, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding, as if he were finally seeing the full distance between the past he had defined and the present he could no longer control. Evelyn did not look back at him immediately. She stepped toward the door, her posture composed, her presence steady, and only then, just before she reached the threshold, she paused, turning slightly, her gaze meeting his one last time. There was no triumph in her expression, no trace of the humiliation he had once attempted to place on her, only calm, grounded certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. "Have the updated model on my desk by Monday morning," she said, her voice even, professional, leaving no space for interpretation. Ryan nodded again, this time without hesitation. "You will have it," he replied, and the words carried weight, not as a promise made to impress, but as a commitment made to be fulfilled. Evelyn held his gaze for a brief moment longer, then inclined her head slightly, a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the silence that surrounded it, and then she turned, walking out of the room without another word, the door closing softly behind her. And in that quiet, final movement, the room remained still for just a second longer, as if acknowledging what had just passed, before the world resumed, but not as it had been, because something fundamental had changed, not through confrontation, not through noise, but through presence. And as Ryan stood there, the remote still resting on the table where he had left it, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that the moment he had tried to define had instead revealed something far greater, something he could no longer rewrite, and something he would now have to learn to meet. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different, quieter in a way that did not come from silence but from distance, as if the world beyond the glass walls moved at a slower pace, unaware of what had just shifted inside. Evelyn Carter walked with steady steps, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor, each sound measured, controlled, her reflection moving alongside her in the long stretch of glass that framed the city beyond. She did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. The past she had once carried into rooms like that no longer followed her. It had been left somewhere far behind, long before today, long before this building, long before Ryan Blake had learned how little control he truly held. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere slowly returned to motion, chairs shifted, quiet conversations resumed. Papers were gathered, but the energy remained altered, more grounded, more aware. Ryan stood still for a moment. Longer after the door closed, his gaze fixed on the space where she had been, not searching, not questioning, simply absorbing. The weight of what had happened did not arrive all at once, it settled gradually, piece by piece, like a realization unfolding rather than striking. Jonathan Reed moved past him without a word, his presence no longer necessary to define the moment, because the moment had already defined itself. Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried earlier replaced with something quieter, something less certain but more real. He reached for the folder on the table, not the presentation he had prepared, but the one that had been placed in front of her, the one that had changed everything. He did not open it, he did not need to. The contents were no longer information, they were reality, and reality did not require confirmation. Across the room, a few executives exchanged brief glances, their expressions thoughtful, no longer aligned with assumption but with understanding. The conversation that followed was softer, more measured, as if everyone present was recalibrating their place within something that had shifted without warning. Ryan finally turned, gathering his materials, his movements slower now, more deliberate, not because he lacked direction, but because he was choosing it differently. The confidence he had relied on before had been built on certainty, on control, on the belief that he understood the structure of the room, but that structure had changed, and with it, so had the foundation beneath him. As he stepped out into the hallway, the light felt sharper, clearer, the city stretching beyond the glass no longer just a backdrop, but a reminder of scale, of consequence, of everything that existed beyond a single room or a single moment. Further down the corridor, Evelyn had already reached the elevator, the doors sliding open with a quiet chime. She stepped inside without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, the reflection of the city lights shifting across the polished metal walls as the doors began to close. For a brief second, the space between floors felt suspended, neither here nor there, a transition, and in that stillness, she allowed herself a single breath, slow, steady, not of relief, not of triumph, but of completion, because this had never been about returning to prove something. It had never been about reclaiming what was lost, it had been about becoming something that could not be taken in the first place. The elevator descended smoothly, the numbers changing one by one, marking progress in a way that felt almost symbolic, and when the doors opened again, the world outside was already moving forward, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had, and somewhere behind her, in a room she no longer needed to enter again, a man stood in the quiet aftermath of a moment he had not understood until it was already over, learning, perhaps, for the first time, that power was not in what you said, or what you controlled, but in what you could no longer deny. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, the kind of light that cut cleanly across the city as if the world itself had decided to move forward without hesitation. Inside the building, the rhythm had returned, but it was not the same rhythm that had existed before. It was steadier now, more aware, shaped by something that had settled into the structure of the place without needing to be announced. Evelyn Carter stepped into her office with the same quiet composure she had carried through the boardroom days earlier. The space was expansive but restrained, glass walls framing the skyline, a large desk positioned not to dominate the room but to anchor it, everything in its place, everything intentional. She set her folder down, her movements unhurried, and for a brief moment, she stood still, looking out over the city that continued to move in patterns both predictable and complex. A reflection of the work that now rested in her hands. There was no sense of arrival in her expression, no pause to mark the significance of what had changed, because for her, this was not an ending, it was a continuation of something she had been building long before anyone had noticed. A quiet knock broke the stillness, measured, professional. "Come in," she said, her voice calm, and the door opened to reveal her assistant, who stepped in with a tablet in hand. "The revised model is here," she said, placing it gently on the desk, "delivered at 8:57. Evelyn glanced at the time briefly, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than approval. "Thank you," she replied, and as the door closed again, she reached for the tablet, her fingers moving with the same precision that had defined every moment before this one. She began to review, her eyes scanning the details, the structure, the adjustments, not quickly, not impatiently, but thoroughly, as if each line mattered because it did. Across the building, Ryan Blake stood at his own desk, the quiet hum of the office surrounding him, the early morning light casting long lines across the floor. He had been there since before sunrise, not out of urgency, but out of focus, the kind that came from understanding that what he was doing now was different from what he had done before. The model he had submitted was not built to impress, it was built to hold, every assumption tested, every risk accounted for, every projection grounded in something he could stand behind, and as he waited, there was no restless anticipation, no attempt to predict her response, only a quiet readiness to accept whatever came next. Back in her office, Evelyn reached the end of the report, her gaze lingering for a moment on the final page, not searching for flaws, but recognizing the shift that had taken place within it. The tone was different, the structure more deliberate, the ambition tempered by clarity. She set the tablet down gently, her fingers resting against the surface for a brief second before she leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but there was something else there now. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, recognition, not of him, but of the work itself. She reached for her phone, dialing a number without hesitation, and when Ryan answered, his voice steady on the other end, she did not speak immediately, allowing a brief pause to settle between them, the kind that carried meaning without needing to define it. The model is stronger, she said finally, her tone even, measured. It reflects ownership. There was no elaboration, no unnecessary words. Because none were needed, Ryan exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. Thank you, he replied, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something that had not been present before, not deference, not submission, but respect. Evelyn listened for a moment longer, then nodded once, though he could not see it. We will move forward with this version, she said, her voice steady, prepare the next phase, and with that, she ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk with the same calm precision. Outside her window, the city continued to move, unchanged and entirely different at the same time, and inside the building, in offices separated by glass and distance, two people moved forward not as they had been defined by the past, but as they now chose to stand, one no longer underestimated, the other no longer unaware, and between them, something quiet and undeniable had been rewritten, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And it would not be undone. The next few days unfolded without spectacle, but nothing about them was ordinary. The kind of quiet progression that did not announce itself yet carried the weight of something deeply established. Evelyn Carter moved through the building with the same composed rhythm, her presence no longer unfamiliar to those who passed her in the halls. There were no whispers now, no sideways glances filled with uncertainty, only recognition, subtle but consistent, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Meetings adjusted around her schedule, conversations sharpened in her presence, decisions held a different level of consideration, not because she demanded it, but because she had made it clear what she expected without ever needing to say it twice. In her office, the pace remained steady, files reviewed, calls taken, strategies refined, each action deliberate, each choice grounded in clarity. She did not revisit the boardroom moment, did not replay it, because for her, it was not something to hold on to, it was something that had already been absorbed into the structure of what came next. Across the floor, Ryan Blake worked with a focus that felt different from before, not driven by the need to prove, but by the need to align. The projects on his desk were no longer opportunities to impress, but responsibilities to deliver. He reviewed numbers with greater care, questioned assumptions more directly, and when he spoke in meetings, his words carried less polish but more substance. The shift was not dramatic, but it was consistent, and over time, consistency reshaped perception more effectively than any single moment could. One afternoon, as the city moved through its usual rhythm of traffic and light, Ryan found himself standing outside her office, the glass door reflecting a version of him that felt unfamiliar, not because he had changed entirely, but because he was seeing himself more clearly than before. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, then knocked lightly, the sound controlled, measured. Come in. Her voice carried through the space, calm as always. He stepped inside, the environment as composed as she was, everything in place, nothing unnecessary. Evelyn looked up briefly from her desk, her gaze steady, acknowledging his presence without surprise. I reviewed the next phase projections, he began, his tone professional, grounded. There are areas that need adjustment before we move forward. She listened without interruption, her attention focused, present, giving him the space to continue, and as he spoke, there was no trace of the man who had once dismissed her, no echo of the certainty that had once defined his voice, only clarity, deliberate and precise. When he finished, the room settled into a brief silence, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective. Evelyn considered his words for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. Then she nodded once, a small, controlled motion. "Show me," she said, her voice even, not as a command, but as an invitation to continue. Ryan stepped forward, placing the updated documents on the desk, and as they reviewed them together, the dynamic between them held steady, not equal in authority, but aligned in purpose. And that alignment carried more strength than any imbalance ever had. There were no lingering shadows of the past. In that moment, no need to revisit what had been said or done, because the present had already rewritten it. Evelyn asked questions where necessary, direct, precise, each one designed to refine rather than challenge, and Ryan answered with the same clarity, no longer anticipating her expectations, but meeting them through understanding. Time moved quietly in that space, measured not by minutes but by progress. And when the discussion concluded, Evelyn leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. "This works," she said, the words simple, but final. Ryan nodded once, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, and as he gathered his documents, there was no need for anything more to be said, because what had changed between them did not require explanation. It existed in the way they now worked, the way they now understood the space they shared. And as he turned to leave, the door closing softly behind him, the office returned to its quiet rhythm. Evelyn's attention already shifting to what came next, because for her, this was never about a single moment of reversal. It was about building something that would not need to be reversed again, and in that quiet, steady continuation, the real transformation revealed itself, not in what had been taken from the past, but in what had been created beyond it. The city outside had shifted into evening by the time the last lights in the office began to dim, a soft glow stretching across glass and steel as the day folded into something quieter, more reflective. Inside her office, Evelyn Carter remained at her desk, the skyline mirrored faintly in the window behind her, the movement of distant traffic tracing lines of continuity through a world that never paused. She had finished the final review hours ago, the decisions made, the direction set, yet she stayed a little longer, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, because moments like this were not marked by applause or announcement. They were recognized in stillness, in the quiet understanding of what had changed and what would never return to what it once was. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed but grounded, her gaze drifting briefly toward the reflection in the glass. And for a fleeting second, she saw not just who she was now, but the distance she had traveled to become her, not in miles or years, but in clarity, in strength, in the quiet refusal to remain where she had once been placed. There had been a time when rooms like this defined her, when voices like his shaped the way she saw herself, when silence felt like weakness instead of choice, but that version of her no longer existed, not because it had been erased, but because it had been understood. And in that understanding, it had lost its power. Across the floor, Ryan Blake gathered his things slowly, the office around him nearly empty now, the hum of the building softer, less demanding. He paused for a moment before turning off his desk lamp, the light fading into the growing evening, and as he stood there, he allowed himself to acknowledge something he had not fully named before, not regret, not in the way people often framed it, but recognition, the kind that came without defense, without justification. He had not lost something that day in the boardroom, he had been shown something about her, about himself, about the way power had once existed between them and the way it no longer did, and that realization did not break him, it steadied him, because for the first time, he was no longer standing on assumptions, he was standing on something real. He stepped into the hallway, the lights dimmed to a softer tone, and as he walked past her office, he slowed, not stopping, not interrupting, just aware. Through the glass, he could see her still seated, calm, composed, exactly as she had been in every moment that had mattered. He did not knock, did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood, and as he continued down the corridor, the distance between them felt different, not a separation, but a space defined by clarity rather than imbalance. Inside her office, Evelyn reached for her coat, rising from her chair with the same quiet control that had carried her through every room she had entered. She turned off the light, the space falling into shadow except for the city beyond the glass, and as she stepped toward the door, she paused for just a moment, her hand resting lightly against the handle, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. This was not a place she had conquered, it was a place she had claimed without needing to fight for it, and that difference mattered more than anything else. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the building nearly still now, her footsteps soft, steady, carrying forward into whatever came next, and as the elevator doors closed around her once more, the reflection that looked back at her was not someone seeking justice, not someone carrying the weight of what had been done, but someone who had already moved beyond it, because in the end, she had not returned to prove him wrong. She had returned as someone he could no longer define, and that was the only victory that had ever mattered.